Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is a Tuesday at 10:15. Hope everyone's doing good. So, here we are on a Tuesday morning, 2023. We're in March, so spring is approaching. Still been pretty wintry. The temperatures temperatures have still been cold. Just got over some pretty big snowstorms. But yeah, so just a quick plug of some things before I get started on this movie that I've been wanting to talk about for actually quite a while. One of the things that ends up happening is I go to Blue Moose, my favorite place. I go there. I probably go there. I don't know, at least once or twice a month. I've been going a little bit less lately, just because of schedule wise scheduling. I typically go a lot of the times when I go to Bull Moose. I typically go on the weekends, and usually like Sunday is my day, or on a Sunday is when I'll go. Usually Sundays are pretty mellow for me. I usually just I teach a lesson usually every Sunday in the morning, and I used to have practices. I used to at one point Sundays were very busy days for me, where I would have usually a lesson, teach a lesson in the morning, a drum set student that I have, and then I would have two rehearsals after that, and they would usually start. The first one would start around like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and then we would go for like 3 hours, and then the second rehearsal would start at about 6, and so we would get done with the first rehearsal around 5ish. I take a little bit of a break, get some dinner, and relax a little bit, and then I have another rehearsal. And that rehearsal would usually go for another 3 hours. So I had that schedule for quite a while last Sunday, and it was good. I mean, I like to play as much as I can, but it was also kind of hard, just being that it's a day to kind of relax, usually for me. But it was usually a busy day, and it was always the reason that was always a thing, or became a thing, was because it was hard for both of those groups that I was playing with, and I still play with them, but it was hard for us to schedule other rehearsals, so I had to kind of make that work, and it worked out really well for the most part. It was a little bit taxing after a while. I'd be pretty wiped out by the end of the day, especially if I had other things going on a weekend. But it worked out. But luckily, Sundays have changed quite a bit, and schedules have changed. So usually now Sundays I have, for the most part, free. So it's kind of nice. And that was usually the day that I would usually go to on a little road trip up to Bull Moose Music. My favorite one that I've always talked about is the Bull Moose Music in Waterville. Waterville's a pretty cool little town. It's definitely changed a lot. Colby College has been buying up a lot of real estate, and has been kind of turning Waterville into, I don't know, kind of an interesting place right now. There's a lot more restaurants. There's actually a brand new movie theater that just opened up there, which I haven't been. They've really put a lot of money into it, and it's become kind of a local attraction, that whole area. I played a gig there when they were in the process of opening up other places. They had bought this, or opened up this giant, huge art gallery, and they were having events, lots of art openings, but then they were also having lots of music in there. And I played a few gigs in there when they were opening, and that was last summer, or the summer before last, or yeah, the early part of last year, the summer season. And I played a couple of gigs there, and since then, I think it was in December of last year, they had all of those projects that they were in the midst of doing. They had everything open, so now it's like this whole big spread. I haven't really been back to that place, or back to that area of Waterville, since its kind of grand opening. So I definitely want to check it out. But I typically go to the Bull Moose in Waterville, just because I think it's got, I don't know, it's a cool it's a cool location. It's kind of in a weird spot. It's in this like weird mini mall kind of spot, but or in this yeah, it's kind of in a strange area, but the that Bull Moose itself, I think, has the overall probably the best movie selection. So that's why I end up going there. And I've said before, like each Bull Moose has a different kind of vibe to it. Each Bull Moose has a different selection to a degree. They carry more or less the same kind of content, where they sell a lot of new stuff, but then part of the allure of going to Bull Moose is they sell a lot of used stuff. Records, lots of records. They have tons of CDs that they sell. They even sell cassettes now, which is crazy. Tons of movies. They have a really good book selection. Video games. They have like tons of anime, which is really popular these days. So they have a pretty cool selection. But each Bull Moose is a little bit different as far as how much they have of particular things. Some are better than others. Than if you're going for looking for music and also for movies. The ones the one in Waterville is really great. That's probably my favorite place overall. And the one in Brunswick is really great too. I like that one. I've been going there a little bit more. That's further away, but I've been going to that one a little bit more often. They have a really it's a smaller selection, but they have a really great movie selection and a pretty good music selection. So I've been going there. And probably the next time I go there, which will probably be in a couple of weeks, I'll probably go to that one because it's a nice little road trip. The other thing that I like going, the reason I love going to the Waterville one is it's a nice. I've been taking these side roads to get up there, and it's about an hour drive. But I go through this pretty scenic area, and it's a real beautiful drive. It's real relaxing going up there, and it's a very, I don't know, it's a really you drive through all of these farms. It takes you up through Freedom and really beautiful little spot. And there's nobody around. It's all like big giant farm fields. There's lots of forest, and it's a really pretty drive. So that's part of the reason I love going up there. But anyway, so I go up there. I this past year and then the beginning of this year, I was going up more often. So I was buying more and more movies. So what ends up happening is I end up buying a bunch of movies and then I watch them and then I do the video is usually based off of those newly purchased movies. But I end up because I've been going a little bit more often. I haven't been there in a couple weeks. I was there 2 weeks ago. But because I've been going a little bit more frequently, I get a little bit backlogged as far as certain films I want to do. But that is not a complaint on my end at all. I just, there's certain films that there are certain movies I've been wanting to get to. But being that I've been going a little bit more often to Bull Moose, I go now probably 2 or 3 times a month, whereas before I would go, once every 2 months. I would space it out more, but I just really enjoy it. I've had a little bit more of an income lately, thanks to there's been a little bit more work, so I've had a little bit more cash. So I've been trying to go a little bit more often. So, and the other thing too is I've heard, and I don't know if it's totally true, but I've heard, through checking out various podcasts. I was listening to a podcast about 5 or 6 months ago, or less than that. And this podcast was really cool. It was about this particular show that was actually on YouTube. This show was a very, was a movie based show, but they had lots of guests, really interesting guests, and they had these guests that were part of like a lot of these CEO guys that were running a lot of these great film companies. They had, the CEO from Synapse, and then also Severin, and it was really great. And all of these labels are so fantastic. You have Synapse, Severin, Mondo Macabra, Blue Underground, Arrow, whole bunch of companies that specialize in putting out all of these wonderful, newly restored and newly released exploitation movies. So that's some really interesting interviews, and I want to check out more of that stuff as I go. But one of the things that was kind of alarming with some of those interviews, which was something I kind of thought could be a possibility, but then I also think, well, maybe it's not. But they were a couple of the guys, particularly the CEO, the founder of Synapse, which is one of the bigger companies that's been putting out these movies. They kind of started the trend. They've been around for about 15 years. They were talking about how they felt this whole thing was, and basically what they were doing, by they've really tapped into this like underground market of people like like myself that really love these films, and they're we're very much part of this like you know collectivist group, more or less, that likes to collect movies, loves to watch these movies, but particularly, they really found this niche of an audience that loves these underground movies, but they're willing to spend quite a bit of money on this stuff, and they collect them. And they were talking about how they were feeling, that this was not going to last very long, and that they were at times struggling, depending on certain releases and certain times of the year. They were kind of struggling a little bit, and they were thinking that within a couple of years, a lot of the stuff might go away, being that they felt they couldn't really. The long term idea around it was that they didn't think they could really compete long term with all of the streaming platforms, and that people seem to have a resistance to collecting physical media because it takes up space and all those things. So it was interesting. But then on the other hand, a lot of the other folks, particularly they had the two guys that run Severn, which was an awesome interview. They were saying how they don't really believe that to be true. They think that they'll be around. The market might get smaller. The demand might get smaller, but he felt that there's enough hardcore, fanatics out there that will still support and want these great, and amazing releases. But that also sparked my curiosity about it and became a little bit of a concern. So I've been wanting to get as many movies as I can because they could go away. I mean, that was like my first reaction. So that kind of fired me up to buy more movies, and luckily I was able to. I've been making a little bit more cash, a little bit more money, so I've been going a little bit more. And I noticed a little around a few months ago that certain in my travels, certain stores, certain Bull Moose stories stores were not. They didn't have quite the selection that they had at one point, and it was kind of making me a little bit sad. But I've noticed since I go mainly to two locations for the most part, I've noticed it's still really good and it's still pretty consistent. But it's increased my desire to buy more movies if it does go away, which I don't think it will. I think it's a tough call, seeing how the whole streaming thing affects this entire industry. But nevertheless, I'm gonna, I've been buying as many of these movies as I can, and I've been really, really loving it. So this is a movie today that I got a couple of years ago, and I've been wanting to get to for quite a while, and that is Herschell Gordon Lewis's She Devil on Wheels. This is a movie that I really, really love. It's a super sleazy kind of biker chick exploitation movie. And it's got elements of horror in it also. But this is like quintessential sleazy exploitation. And it's directed and written by, the master of exploitation, Herschell Gordon Lewis. One of my all-time favorite directors. I've done a few shows where I've reviewed some of his movies, and I've talked a lot about him throughout a lot of these different videos that I've been posting here on YouTube. He's one of my favorites. He's probably my favorite like exploitation director all around. And he's definitely my favorite director from the United States. And he is such a unique, well, to use the word artist, that's subjective, but because he didn't really take himself that seriously. He really, he was in it for the money. He was invested in the art of what exploitation is. But I don't know. I feel like on some on some on some fronts and in some circles, people dismiss Herschell Gordon Lewis as just being this, you know, this trashy director that didn't really have any, depth to his work. But I've seen lots of his films. I've bought a lot of his films over the last few years, and I'm still buying them because he was an incredibly prolific director, and his whole thing was kind of about this pulpy, you know, doing these movies about that incorporated this like trash culture aesthetic, and I just love his stuff to death. And one thing I've noticed over the years since I've been diving into his work more and more and checking out all of his films is that he definitely had a style. He definitely had, when you put in a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, you kind of know it. And he was notorious for not only being so prolific as a director, but a lot of his methods, have been talked about or that I've discussed and that have been out there about how he would shoot movies. Just the very definition of I don't know. I think of him as just this like outsider punk rock figure in a lot of ways. He totally worked outside of the Hollywood system in every way possible. Like the Hollywood system typically does have a very specific method on how, or a specific plan as to how they make movies. Where there is an intensive period around the script. There's usually when a director gets hired for a particular project, there is lots of preparation. There's all kinds of you know all kinds of things that are part of that because there's a lot of money running and there's a lot of money on the line. There's and then eventually the distribution of all those things and those projects and those films. And they spend typically lots of time hiring the right cast, the right actors. But Herschel Gordon Lewis totally worked outside of that. That's why I think of him as like this punk rocker, because he was notorious for shooting so many movies back to back for just with minuscule budgets, like next to nothing. And his legendary collaborations with Dave Friedman, who Dave Friedman was one of his longtime collaborators, and Dave Friedman was like basically his producer. He helped market the movies and he helped finance them. And Dave Friedman's background was basically he worked in the adult industry, and he worked on his early part of his career. He was a big part of the kind of the adult uh, sleazy porn films that were coming out in the early 60s and 50s, kind of when pornography was put to film. Basically, he was one of the first guys, and then he eventually moved into the whole like sex exploitation world. And then when he started collaborating with Herschel Gordon Lewis, they built you know, this this unique style, and he ended up producing and working with him for many many years. But they're both like Dave Friedman and Herschel Gordon Lewis. I feel like they're right out of like they're like carny entertainers. But Herschel Gordon Lewis was known for where when they would do these shoots for these films, they would basically there were many stories of where they would find people on the streets, people who had zero acting ability, and he would pull them into the movie and say, okay, here are your lines, let's go for it. And then they would do one or two takes of it, and a lot of times keep those scenes. And so which is so crazy when you think about it. Like there's that real infamous scene on probably the best, probably definitely my favorite Herschell Gordon Lewis movie, Blood Feast. And there's a scene at the end, at the climax of the movie, where there is these like truck drivers, and there's a whole scene of where the whole story builds up, where the police are going after the lead character who's the murderer, and he ends up getting kind of accosted by these garbage men or these truck drivers, and and that's where the movie ends. And that whole scene is kind of just amazing. But the whole story around it was that Herschel Gordon Lewis literally saw these guys with their truck and just hired them right on the spot and got them in the movie. And they did this scene together. And this was like the end of the movie, and it's in the movie. And these two guys had no experience whatsoever, being actors. And so he was notorious for doing lots of things like that, and a lot of his films were, and then also not, one and done kind of, scenarios where he never really did many takes of a lot of the films, of a lot of his scenes. But he also, on the other front, he also composed a lot of the music for a lot of his films, and he definitely had a particular style. So, like, on one hand, he's like dismissed as, just a pure, trash culture director. But I kind of feel, and he's even said in many interviews that he never really, kind of considered himself to be an artist. He was kind of in it for the money, because he was, the definition of an exploitation director. But he also felt he, was, kind of saying something with his films, but he was having a lot of fun and just, going for this wild ride. And I think that kind of energy, when you watch his films, I feel, being a fan of his stuff is infectious, because it's just like this wild, carny, pulpy exploitation universe that you feel as a viewer you're being pulled into, and it's so unconventional and so weird and so strange. And so there's been, one of the things I saw last year, there was an interview with Stephen King, because Herschel Gordon Lewis had passed away. He passed away a couple of years ago. And there was some interview I saw with Stephen King, the famous, American horror author. He was saying how, in the interview, I think they were talking, the person who was doing the interview, I don't know if it was like Rolling Stone, some major publication, was doing an interview with Stephen King, and they had brought up about Herschel Gordon Lewis. And, the early directors who kind of laid the bedrock, or the groundwork for horror and what is horror. And Herschel Gordon Lewis's name came up in the interview, and Stephen King totally like dismissed him as like, being kind of insignificant. Didn't even really consider him to be a director. And on one hand, I can kind of understand people having that idea of him, because his stuff is so trashy and just so like unconventional. But at the same time, if you've seen a few of his movies, he definitely had a style. And I feel like some of his, well, all of his films that I've seen, they're just such great rides, and they're so entertaining, they're so bizarre. And it's like reading, just a classic pulp novel or pulp short story that would have come out in the 50s or 60s. Like, it's just, I don't know, it's just gritty, it's really raw, it's super sleazy, and it's got this, it's kind of wrapped up in this, where you feel like there's like a taboo around it, and it's kind of like this weird, like, forbidden fruit. That's even how Dave Friedman had described a lot of their films, is, the whole idea of the forbidden fruit. And sometimes touching on, or going, or you know going into areas that are kind of forbidden in for stories, particularly around films. And that's what those guys did. They kind of focused on a lot of those taboos. So even though I totally disagree, I can understand Stephen King's argument or his opinion of Herschel Gordon Lewis. I at the same time totally disagree with him because I do regard Herschel Gordon Lewis, even though his stuff is, you know, at to a degree at face value, pretty terrible, but at the same time, it's truly that definition of it's so bad it's good. And he definitely had a style. He definitely had a style. And he was so unconventional. And I think for what he was and what he did with so little in terms of like the resource, like being, financially backed, he was wildly creative, and he had a really unique style. But the biggest thing, so I consider him to be, a great director. He's one of my favorite directors, even though it's so unconventional, compared to, quote unquote highbrow directors like, say, Kubrick or Steven Spielberg. Um, and I love those guys. I mean, Kubrick being my favorite director of all time. But even though his stuff was so against, quote unquote, the normal way of making a movie, I he's easily one of my favorite directors of all time. But the thing that I think gives Herschel Gordon Lewis that extra, well, almost where I feel like he should be, to a degree, looked at as kind of this pioneer and also kind of an iconic director for what he was doing. And his career was a really expansive career. I mean, he covered his, I mean, multiple decades. I mean, from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. I mean, so incredibly prolific. I kind of feel, from what I've gathered and from what I have learned over the last few years, I would say he's probably the most, or was the most prolific American exploitation director that I've come across. I mean, you're talking from like 80 to 100 movies, even more. I have about probably about 13 of his movies, and there's still a lot that I haven't gotten yet, and still a lot that I want to see. So, I mean, just easily probably the most prolific director. But the thing that I was saying before that I feel like really commands respect, and I think puts him to a degree on an extra high or a higher pedestal to a degree for, in regards to other directors, was he was doing these gore movies. He was the first director to, introduce copious amounts of violence and gore on the big screen. He was the first director in history to ever do that. Which, you know, I mean, when you figure he was doing these, gore films, and to a degree these, slasher films, he was doing these films, in the late 50s and 60s, which is wild. I mean, light years ahead of, films like Friday 13th, or all this, or say, all of the amazing slasher films that were coming out in the 70s to the 80s. He was doing this like, sometimes 15 years before. And he was the first director to actually put gore on the big screen. And I've seen a lot of these packages, a lot of these great movies that I have of his come with, really great special features. And there's been a few guys that I've seen talk about him that are, film critics or people that are also filmmakers. And they say that, they're in terms of like, if you're a fan of horror and you watch a film that has, basically any kind of sense of gore or blood in it, or has any scenes of like violence where there's copious amounts of gore, or where it's kind of sleazy or has some kind of sexual thing in it, you have to like realize that like the guy who started that was Herschell Gordon Lewis. Like he was the first one. He was the pioneer. For a long time growing up, my first exposure to like the slasher films, which is my favorite genre in the exploitation world, I always attributed as a kid to like say the Friday the 13th franchise. And during that time I also was exposed to various American exploitation movies, like The Car and Tourist Trap, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all those great movies, all those classics. But I was also exposed to a lot of great Italian directors. I just did a show yesterday on Lucio Fulci. I just did a show on Suspiria finally, which had been wanting to get to forever. So I was exposed to a lot of the Italian directors at a young age, and then also the other horror films I was really into and that I seen a lot as a kid were the classic Hammer horror films, which was the British studio in England that put out all of these incredible vampire movies, Dracula movies starring Christopher Lee. And I, for a long time growing up, I thought, okay, that maybe Friday the 13th is where that whole thing started. And even say Halloween, John Carpenter's original. I kind of felt, oh, this is where it started. Like, these movies came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And I love those movies to death. I still do so much. But it was interesting. And I kind of thought, okay, that's kind of where the gore thing started. And then over the years, I started buying those movies, and I started getting the movies that I had seen as a kid. I started buying them more and more on Blu-ray, and started diving more and more into that world. And then I started discovering, it led me to discover lots of other amazing American slasher films that were coming out at the time that actually came out before the Friday the 13th series. So then I started thinking, oh, okay, this franchise didn't start that. This franchise wasn't the first film to put gore on film. And then I also started diving back into the Italian exploitation world. And I saw, oh, well, these movies even go back further than the American slasher films. And so I thought for a long time, oh, okay, so the gore thing started in Italy. That's a unique. They were doing it before the Americans. And then it was only about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, probably about 3 or 4 years ago was when I first discovered Herschell Gordon Lewis. And the first movie I saw of his was Blood Feast, which is probably my all-time favorite. And then I saw like 2000 Maniacs and a bunch of his other movies. And I just couldn't believe how old this stuff was. Like, you're talking early 70s, late 60s even, and even further back. And I was just like, holy crap, like this stuff even predated the Italian directors. And that's when I realized, like, wow, Herschell Gordon Lewis, he has that name. I mean, a lot of times he's referred to as the godfather of gore. And being such an avid fan of horror and, really interested in seeing how, as a genre, how it's developed over the years and seeing kind of where it is now, but then really trying to trace it back to see the origins of this, to see where this whole crazy genre started. That's when I realized, wow, Herschell Gordon Lewis was the guy who introduced all of these elements on the big screen. And so that in itself, I feel like, puts him on this certain kind of pedestal, like a special place as a legitimate director, because he was a carny showman. He was an exploitation director. He was in it for the money, for probably, that was the main reason he was doing it. But he also had a style. But aside from that, he truly was the godfather of gore. So really interesting, tracing these things back and finding out, the lineage and where these things started. And so this is a movie where, and Herschell Gordon Lewis did lots of different kinds of movies. He did, sex exploitation movies, crime exploitation movies. He did lots of like horror movies, obviously. The Wizard of Gore, amazing movie. I did a show on that a few months ago. Blood Feast, amazing. Probably my favorite Herschell Gordon Lewis movie. And also, the first film I ever saw of his was 2000 Maniacs, which that movie is so, I think, completely insane. I couldn't when I first saw that movie, I kind of couldn't believe I couldn't believe that this movie was made, and especially when it was made. I mean, just wild. And I totally fell in love with his work. And since then, I've been buying lots of his films. And this movie here is no exception. He also made a series of like these biker gang movies, like chicks on bikes, basically. And this movie is so freaking fun. She Devils on Wheels. And I've seen this movie a bunch of times since I bought it. This came out. This is one of his early movies too. This came out in 1968, which is just wild. And this package, Arrow, the company Arrow puts out they've put out all of Herschell Gordon Lewis's movies. I've seen it in stores where you can buy, and I've seen it on YouTube with different guys that are into a lot of his films, where they usually buy the box set, where they'll have the whole collection of his films, which is really cool. But I really I've been holding out. I've been wanting to do it this way, where when I came across that Arrow was putting out each individual movie, and they were each like getting amazing treatment. That's what I wanted to get, and that's I own I own a pretty good amount of his movies at this point. And I'm still looking to buy more because again, easily the most prolific American exploitation director. 80 to 100 movies, maybe more. It's just it's insane. The I wanted to hold out and buy these special editions because they're so awesome. They're packed with you know a few hours of special features. It's just fantastic. And the other thing that's so awesome, the artwork, is just incredible. A lot of the times, these movies also come with two movies. They'll come with another one of Herschell Gordon Lewis's movies that is even more obscure. And so each disc is like two movies, and it's just awesome. So if you're into this crap, it's a smorgasbord. It's pretty wonderful. Um, Basically, the story, if you want to call it a story for this movie, it's centered on an all-girl bike gang that is burning rubber and taking names as they terrorize the small town in Florida. These girls rule the roads and the men they want, and they initiate new members that only have one creed to live by: don't ever fall in love. Just amazing. And that pretty much sums up this movie. It's it's so unbelievably trashy, this movie, and but just amazing. And the other thing that's wild about this movie, and a lot of these exploitation movies for that matter, is kind of the lead roles and kind of the heroes of the story, or the kind of the dominant figures in a lot of these movies are played by women. So that's pretty unprecedented because most Hollywood films are kind of dominated by male leads, and the men, or the male character is the one who kind of typically saves the day. But in a lot of his films, and definitely this one, it's all ruled by women, and they're just super badass, and they just like kick everyone's ass. The music is just incredible. The transfer of this on Blu-ray is just unbelievable. To think that this movie that is, all intents and purposes, is kind of a piece of trash, and to see that it was transferred from the original film to Blu-ray and 4K, and a movie that is so trashy, like so unbelievably trashy, gets the most unbelievable royal treatment, is to me just unbelievable. It just blows me away every time I realize that, and it's incredible. Like it's incredible. This like these editions of his films that Arrow put out, they're kind of like equivalent to like the treatment that they get it's kind of like equivalent to like the Criterion Collection. And the Criterion Collection is a real amazing company where they pretty much do they re-release these movies that are considered to be American film classics and foreign film classics, but they've broadened their whole company, and they have lots of other films that every now and then I'm kind of surprised that they're in the list of movies that they offer. But for the most part, they're considered to be art films, and they're high art films. A lot of foreign films, a lot of Ingmar Bergman films. Really amazing films. But they also cover things like David Lynch, and all kinds of things. But a lot of the times, it has this thing around it where they're like art films. They're like really high end, high quality movies that are made. But like a movie like this is not a high quality movie. It's like completely, you know, in most regards, just a piece of total trash. And to see that a film like this gets this kind of treatment is just like hilarious and just amazing to me. And it's amazing. Like, and I think right now, being a fan and a collector of films, this is like the greatest the greatest time to be a movie fan. I mean, it's unbelievable. So, yeah, She Devil on Wheels, 1968. I mean, this movie is such a journey in trash culture. I love this movie to death. It's it's a like I said, it's essentially a biker chick movie. It's pretty violent and it's hilarious. And I feel like pretty much all of Herschell Gordon Lewis's movies, I feel like they're like party movies. They're movies that you could throw on with your friends if you're drinking some beers or just having a good time and you want to just have just laugh your ass off and just have a good time. I feel like his movies are that, like they're just so entertaining. And this is like one of the best ones, I think, in his collection. I've seen this a bunch of times since I bought it. Super trashy biker movie. Definitely has elements of horror. It's pretty gory, particularly the ending. It's pretty gory. But again, like I said, it's entertaining as all hell. So can't recommend this movie enough. Herschell Gordon Lewis, he's the man. She Devil on Wheels, 1968. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for checking out this channel. Keep the comments going. I love when people want to interact, where we talk about these awesome films that I love. And I love seeing that there's people who dig this stuff as well. So thanks again. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe. And we will see you next time. Peace.